Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. Today I'm doing something a little bit different. This is for the beginner riders out there. Figured I would give my take on how to ride a motorcycle. Seems complicated, especially if you haven't really been around them much. So we're going to do a quick recap of what controls are what, but there are some assumptions. So the first assumption is you already know how to ride a bicycle. That guarantees that you've got the concepts of balance and leaning to turn and all those things already sorted out before you get on something that's a bicycle with an engine. Seemed like a pretty reasonable assumption to me. The second thing is that you are somewhat mechanically inclined, because I'm an engineer, so I think of things mechanically. If you're not mechanically inclined, this is probably not the beginner tutorial for you. But for somebody out there, I'm sure it'll be helpful. So the first thing you got to do is recognize where all of the controls are. So on the front right hand, not that you have any rear hands, the lever here is the front brake. And comparing this to a bicycle, you'll find that on a bike, the front brake, it doesn't bite right away. So you can pull and then pull twice as hard and you won't get twice the braking. But on a motorcycle, you've got hydraulics helping you out, and this thing will lock up the front tire. Really hard to do on a bicycle, easy to do on a motorcycle. So when you go to ride, just remember, this front brake is powerful, and you can't just panic brake. If you do, you will end up flipping. This right here, twisty, is the throttle. And on this bike, I don't want to keep doing that because it's old school, so there's nothing preventing this from just kind of squirting some fuel in every time. Yeah, so this is the throttle. Forward is closed, and then as you would expect, you open the throttle this way. So when the engine's idling, you don't need any throttle, just like your car. And if you give it a little bit of throttle, it will rev up accordingly. On the left hand, you've got this lever, which pulls all the way in at any speed at any time. This is the clutch. When it's pulled in, the engine, regardless of the speed of the engine, is disconnected from the rear wheel, regardless of the speed of the wheel. So whenever you want them to be matched, the clutch goes out and the road speed, i.e. the speed of the rear wheel, and the engine speed are matched. So we use that to our advantage. For example, to come to a stop, you can pull this so that even though the engine is rotating, the rear wheel is allowed to stop and you don't kill your engine. So that's the clutch. On this bike, this is the choke, which is kind of irrelevant for learning how to ride, but most bikes have a choke, and it's what you use to start it cold. Last bit here is going to be the neutral indicator. Virtually every bike, especially all road legal bikes, will have some kind of indicator for neutral. Kind of helpful if you're fairly new to the whole process. And that just tells you what gear you're in as long as that gear is neutral. So the way neutral works, a lot of people who've never really driven a manual transmission might not really know, since neutral is kind of something you don't use that often. Neutral means kind of like artificially pulling in the clutch. It disconnects the engine from the rear wheel. When the bike's in neutral, you don't need the clutch to do that. So it's basically a gear devoted to disconnecting the engine from the rear wheel. Alright, that goes over the controls up here, but on the feet, on a motorcycle, you have foot controls. So off of this right foot, this right here is the rear brake. So front brake here, rear brake here. On the other side, this is your gear shifter. So motorcycles have an interesting arrangement of gears. Currently we're in neutral, that's why our neutral indicator is lit up. And if neutral's here, you push down on the gear shift, down to first. Second is past neutral, up, and then it goes third, fourth, fifth. So you might ask, well, why would they make it so that you have to shift from first to neutral to second? In order to get from first to second, since that's such a common gear, why not do neutral 1, 2, 3? And a lot of machines, especially four-wheelers, do it that way. But there's a key advantage on a motorcycle to the arrangement of neutral, first, second, third. And that is, a lot of times you rely on the engine and the power that you get when you twist your wrist for balance. On a four-wheeler, it's a lot less tied to control of the vehicle as to what gear you're in. So they arrange it this way on a motorcycle so that at any point you can jam down on the gear 100 times, and that is first gear. So it's a convenient way to always land in a gear and never find yourself wanting power from the engine and finding that you're in neutral, like you would be if you jammed down, down, down on a four-wheeler. Okay, future me. I think that I forgot to mention when I was discussing neutral first, neutral second, third. Motorcycle transmissions are designed with a special mechanism between first and second. So if I show you here, I'm in neutral, pulling the clutch in, first gear. Now watch, if I just pull, I'm not going to stop pulling, I'm just pulling. Pulls 1/2 click in neutral, and then a second click, neutral's off, and I've only pulled once. So what it's doing is it's pulling from first through neutral into second into a single shift. And that allows you from first to pop right into second without missing a beat. And then the way you find neutral, tap, tap, tap to get to your first gear, and then you come up a 1/2 click, and that's your neutral. So again, first gear, 1/2 click, there's neutral. Okay, so I think that pretty much covers the controls, and let's move on to how you actually ride. Before we start this thing up and get to that point, I've got a couple key concepts to cover. First of all, when the engine's running, it's rotating. If you can hear it, it's rotating. The cylinder's moving, combustion is happening, engine is rotating. If you're sitting at a stop, obviously your rear wheel is not rotating. That tells you that either you need to be in neutral, where the engine and the wheel can be disconnected, or you need to have this clutch in. If one of those two things is not true, and for example, if it's in first and the bike is running and this clutch is out, this bike is rolling because the rotation of the engine is directly linked to the rotation of the rear wheel. So a running engine means a rolling motorcycle. The way I think people do this wrong is they teach people when they're first starting, use some throttle and let this out in gear and you'll just start rolling, and then assume that people have the presence of mind to control their throttle, control their clutch, and balance all at the same time. I think that's too much to ask of a new rider, and this is the way I prefer to do it. So we've basically failed our first objective, which is to find a relatively quiet place, but I'm an experienced rider and I'm not too worried about traffic as I do this here. So starting the bike, that's my little starter button. Oh, also important to note, this is the kill switch. At any point you can turn off of, most machines have it here. Sometimes it's just a single button, but in this case it's a forward-backward switch. And yeah, handy if the bike falls down and you need to turn it off really quick, you can just walk up and tap that switch. So the key thing I think that most people miss is they get taught, okay, right here we are, first gear, I push down on this shifter, so again, neutral, push down, there we go, that's first gear, neutral indicator came off. And what most people do as new riders, or what they're taught to do, is give it a little gas and let the clutch out. So what you see happen is people don't understand how much is a little gas. And so they'll do something like this, and then they'll let the clutch out. Well, that's fine, because at first nothing's happening. You've got the clutch in, so the disconnection between the wheel and the engine means that you can rev it all day and you're not going to go anywhere. But what happens is people are letting the clutch out and they're giving it too much fuel, and when it starts to move, they're giving it way too much fuel, and then they freak out, they let go of the clutch, and it happens like this. If you could see behind me, I just dusted myself out because that rear wheel spun up. could make it more impactful, I'm sure, if I was on the pavement and you saw a wheelie, but I think the point is made. The way a person ought to be taught to ride is just like this, idling in first gear. My clutch is pulled, but notice I'm only using 2 fingers. If I use 4 fingers, that means that I have nothing to pull on the bars without pulling on the clutch. You see? What I want to be able to do is pull on the bars with my pinky and my ring finger while holding the clutch at a constant position. You can only do that if you're splitting your fingers up. So this is how I typically ride, and after a long day, you know, you get tired and you end up pulling with 3 or 4 fingers just for being tired. But to start off, you should start with a 50-50 like this in first gear, and don't touch that throttle. Put your hand on the bar, but don't twist. In fact, twist the other way a little bit. Lock it in, that's okay. The very first thing you're going to do is you're going to let this clutch out, just real slow, and you're going to gauge. Oh, you hear that? You can hear and feel, obviously you can see the bike rocking, you can hear and feel the moment that your engine and your rear wheel begin to engage. Again, the clutch is what separates the rotating engine from the rear wheel. If you pull it in, they're disconnected. When you let it out all the way, they are connected. So whatever the engine does, the rear wheel does. So the very first thing you do is you let the clutch out until you can start to feel that engagement. And you might let it out too far and do that. So what happened? I let the clutch out so fast that the engine at idle didn't have enough power to move the bike and its mass. So try again. Here's what we'll do. Let the clutch out a little bit until you start to feel that. See, I'm just letting the bike roll on its own. I'm not moving it. This is the engine. But notice, the engine doesn't have a lot of power on idle. So if I let this clutch out fast, that's all it has the power to do. It's a 3-inch scoot. So there's very little danger in learning to operate a motorcycle essentially stationary like this. As long as you can touch the ground, you can continue to practice letting the clutch out and walking with the bike just a little bit at a time. So here I am, I'm letting the clutch out, but now I'm just walking with this thing. And if I get to the point where the clutch is out all the way like this, I'm officially riding, but I'm just kind of walking with the bike. And if I want to stop, I can pull in the clutch so that they're no longer connected, and now I'm coasting. Okay? So that's the first thing I do. Anytime I teach somebody to ride, it's 0 fuel. You do not twist this throttle. You let the bike's idle and the power at idle carry you forward, and you walk with it and get a sense for how far you have to pull in and how far you have to let out until it's engaging and disconnecting. So for this bike, it starts about there. You can see it wants to roll, and then if I go a little farther, it's rolling. Once you master that, and I mean take the time to do 30 repetitions of from 0 to coast walking, if you do that, you're ready to ride. The only thing you're missing from that moment, let me get back up on the pavement here. So the only thing you're missing after you learn how to do that is throttle control. But in first gear, you're fairly harmless. So what I suggest is that you let the clutch out, no fuel, get to a walking pace, and when the clutch is out all the way, like this, now add a tiny bit of fuel. Okay, when you feel like the bike is stable, you put your feet up on it. Voila! You're now riding a motorcycle. Okay? This, while you're going slow, is the point to emphasize you have got to learn muscle memory of how to stop. You can't just stop, because watch, if I let go of my throttle, I'll slow back down to what is the idle speed, my walking speed, right? So here we are, idle speed. Now, if I want to stop, I might push my rear brake down here or my front brake up here, and if I do, watch. What did I do? Well, I'm in gear, and my clutch is out. So that means that the rotation of the engine and the rotation of the wheel are connected. when I came to a stop without disconnecting that rotation, I essentially stopped the engine with my brakes. So, doing that again, all you have to do, slow down as far as you want, and when you're ready to stop, you pull in the clutch, because now they're disconnected. So if I do nothing, at this point I'll just coast to a stop, because the engine of the rotation is disconnected from the wheel. So eventually, like a bicycle, you'll just stop rolling. The very next thing to learn is accelerating and then braking. So you want, at this stage, you can start, you can stop, but you need to practice this more than 10 times. This should be probably a 20 to 30 repetition thing. So you start first gear, you come to a stop, you pull the clutch in, you brake, come to a stop. Now you do it again, no fuel, just the clutch, walk with it, and when you feel like you're stable, put your feet up and then start to give it fuel. Notice I'm not pulling the clutch in any. This is how you get comfortable with the starting and stopping. After a while, you can speed up in first and then brake harder. That skill is important. You need to understand how much force on your lever translates to braking force. And of course, eventually, maybe you'll be able to do something like this. I needed to get out of there. I can't see with the sun behind me. It doesn't feel safe. So, we covered from a dead stop with no fuel how you can learn how to walk with your bike at idle with no risk. There's no accidental wheeling in this approach. There's no unexpected whiskey throttle, which I haven't really defined, but I hope you know what it is. And overall, it represents a pretty safe way to get acquainted with a motorcycle. Now, there are a couple other tips and tricks worth knowing, so let's talk about some of those here. So here we are in neutral. I can stop because I'm in neutral, and I know that the engine is disconnected from the rear wheel because of that. When you get better, you will have to learn how to start with fuel. So this is really the last step that you need to learn before you can shift. So how do you start while using the throttle and the clutch? Well, the truth is, it's very similar to starting without the throttle. So just like without the throttle, you'll get your clutch right at that point where you can tell it's starting to grab on the engine, right there. And instead of letting the idle walk you forward, which is sometimes hard, right there, it almost wants to die before I start rolling. Now, instead of that, you wait until it's trying to die on you, right about here, and you give it a little throttle, just a little. And that's what people miss. They think that it's throttle, clutch, and so what you get is whiskey throttle, which, since I've said it twice now, I should probably define it. Whiskey throttle is like this. So I'm in first gear. Now ignore what I'm doing with the clutch because I know what I'm doing. I'm just trying to demonstrate this. If I accidentally accelerate quickly like this, okay, what happened? Well, you should have seen that my helmet came back. What does that do to my throttle hand? What it does is if I turn this bike off, if I lean back, watch that throttle, my fingers unwrap from the throttle and they twist it. This is the key aspect of whiskey throttle. And what happens is somebody who's on a motorcycle for the first time, they're loose like this. And so when the bike goes forward, they allow their arms to be straightened. And once they're straight, they don't have a tight grip. And so what they do is they get straight, and then and that's all it takes. If you're in gear because you went forward, right? If you're in gear, then the very next thing that happens, if you accidentally hit the accelerator quickly, get thrown back, the next thing that happens is you are accidentally pinning the throttle. That's called whiskey throttle, and it's the reason you see all of the dirt bike fail videos where somebody is wheeling unintentionally, hanging off the back of their motorcycle. It's because their brain is saying do not let go, but by the fact that they're still holding on, they're still twisting the throttle. So to avoid that, a couple things: keep your elbows looser. It's okay to lean forward just a little bit so that if the bike does buck under you like that, it's not like this. And then second, you need to figure out how to carefully apply throttle with the clutch. So here's how you do that. When you get that clutch just biting, add little blips of throttle. So you're never going to be thinking of, like in a car, where you'll say, okay, I'm accelerating. No. All you do is you let the clutch out until you're catching in the clutch, and then you... Yeah? So as you do that, you're continuing to let the clutch out in exactly the same way you would if you were walking the bike. But with small throttle blips, it means that you have more power available to you. So let's try that again. From a stop, if I do no throttle, I get this. That's as fast as I can accelerate. One more time. The fastest I can accelerate from here is this. That's it, and the engine will die. So what we do when we want to go quickly from a stop is we get it to the point where it's engaging, and suddenly I'm rolling, I'm in gear. And by virtue of the blip, you prevent the mistake of whiskey throttle. So grip tight, keep slack in your elbows, and once you're rolling, then your throttle can be smooth. You still want to avoid the application of a lot of throttle, obviously, because if you're still learning and in first gear, you got a ways to go. But that's a very important skill that I see most people, when they're teaching other people, they're teaching it wrong. Okay, so there's that. The last and most fun part of riding a motorcycle is shifting gears. So in exactly the same way, when you're stopped, you have to be careful with your clutch, because at any moment, if you let this out, engine's rotating, wheels not. When you connect them, the engine tries to spin the wheels, and depending on how much power the engine has, which means how much throttle you're giving it, it will either win and spin the rear wheel or lose and kill the engine. What you do to shift is very similar to what you do to start from a stop. And that's why I make this point so repeatedly. Once you get going, like this, pretend you're stopped. Okay, so in your head, you're like, okay, I'm stopped. No throttle, clutch in, shift. Now I'm in second gear, and the same blip principle applies. So you're letting your clutch out, you're at a stop, you don't have any throttle. You can, if you're still getting comfortable, you can let the bike's idle speed carry you and start walking with it. And then as you get more and more comfortable, you know, you don't need those slow starts anymore. So you get the clutch to that spot and you start blipping. Okay, there you go. Now you're rolling. And once you're rolling in first, it's exactly like you're at a stop. No throttle, pull the clutch in, shift to second. Now you're rolling, and you can let the clutch out again. And you're now in second. Same exact process for the remaining gears. there you go. So here we are, straight down the road. Now, without any extra thought, I pull in the clutch with no throttle. I shift up from third to fourth or second to third. Now I'm moving still, so I'm not too worried. I can let the clutch out. You hear how the engine and the wheel match pace. So if I speed up here, and then I'll pull the clutch in. Now we know it was revved up, but now it's idling. If I let the clutch out, what is that? That's the wheel spinning faster than the engine, which was idling. And when I let the clutch out, the wheel is reconnected with the engine, but because the wheel is rotating fast and has power, since you're sitting on you got good grip and it's got enough traction to twist the engine, it will force the engine to match the speed of the rear wheel through all the gear ratios. So, in closing, motorcycle riding is not as complicated as people like to make it sound, and a lot of people give you terrible advice for your first time on a motorcycle. So, learn how to ride a bicycle. The brakes are powerful, and the last real important thing is that the clutch is what connects and disconnects the engine from the rear wheel spin. So as you speed up in first gear, you reach a point where you want to shift, cut the throttle, pull the clutch, and shift your transmission into the next gear. Now you're in the next gear, and all you have to do is reconnect the wheel to the engine and apply more speed. That's all it is. Eventually, you get good at figuring out how much speed you're trying to apply, and you can start riding wheelies. So yeah, guys, get out there and ride. Be safe, and I'll catch you in the next one. Later.